This is Outrageous History. Hello, I'm Ernest Granson, and welcome to Outrageous History. On a recent podcast, I had the pleasant opportunity to hear about high-profile U.S. entertainers who performed on the front lines during the Second World War. Those performances were called Jeep shows because it was that quintessential American military vehicle, the Jeep, which transported the entertainers and their equipment to the combat troops. While we may be familiar with today's versions of the Jeep, whether it's the off-road Wrangler and Gladiator or the more urban-oriented Grand Cherokee and Wagoneer, you might be surprised at just how distanced those luxury vehicles are from the original military vehicle. Author Paul Bruno has compiled a comprehensive and revealing early history of the all-purpose military workhorse. Called The Original Jeeps, the book explains how the United States' unpreparedness for World War II resulted in the tenacious race by three automotive manufacturers to design and land the contract to build the military Jeep. And Paul is with us today. We thank you for being here today, Paul.
Oh, thanks for having me. Glad to be on.
Paul, there are a number of aspects in the story of the original Jeep which I found really intriguing, all of which I'd like to talk about as we get into the conversation. But first, you spent years on researching and writing this book. What was your motivation behind investing so much time and effort into this particular subject?
Well, that's a good question. It all started in 1999. My late wife and I were beginning to write screenplays. We wanted to see if we could write history stories that could maybe be made into movies. And one day I'm watching the Big Rigs of Combat history on the History Channel, back when they had history on the History Channel, all those decades ago. And, the exciting life that I live. And before the commercial break, they said the first Jeep was built by a bankrupt car company in Butler, Pennsylvania in the miraculous time frame of 49 days. And I'm like, I didn't know that. So after the commercial break, they went through it in a little bit. And if I knew 25 years later I'd still be talking about it, maybe I wouldn't have watched, after the commercial break and everything that I've gone through to tell the story. But I was just like, wow, that would make a great movie. Here you got this bankrupt car company. The Army absolutely needs this vehicle. It's considered impossible to even build it, let alone in 49 days. And so my wife and I tried for 12 years to get that movie made, and we were unsuccessful. So in 2011, we decided, this story should be told. So we decided to write a book. And so I knew that I needed more material than I had already researched to be able to write the screenplay. And so I went to the National Archives, and long story short, I found, and we'll talk about the court case that I found enough material to write the books. And so I wrote a book in 2014 that was just on the first Jeep, called Project Management History of the First Jeep. And then over the years, I realized there was more to the story about, like you said, three companies had competed to build the vehicle, Willis Overland and Ford being the other two, and to tell their whole story. Well, it took another 10 years to complete the whole story, but I finally was able to complete the whole story last year. And now we have what I consider, humbly, the magnum opus on the creation and development of the Jeep. You hit the nail on the head. My expertise is in the early history, from World War I through the end of 1941, when basically the Jeep had been completed in its form as the Willis MB. And the other motivation was I'd read books or see books on, or articles, anything on the Jeep. And it was always like, there was three companies that competed. Bantam was the first one. They built it in 49 days. Willis did this. Ford kind of did a little of that. And then into the war. And no one in 85 years had comprehensively told all the story of what happened for the Jeep to be able to become the vehicle it was when we entered the war in late 1941.
Yeah, I mean, those histories really didn't do justice to what actually happened. And speaking of that, you go into detail about the situation that led to it, and as you explained, following the First World War, and up until really at 1939 when Germany annexed Czechoslovakia, and then only months later, of course, moved on to Poland. Not only was the U.S. military undermanned and ill-equipped, uh, but both the government and the public were completely apathetic to participation of any kind, or of participation of any kind, or any kind of war. So, give us a rundown on the political situation leading to the eventual deployment of full-time U.S. armed forces.
Well, yeah, the political situation and well, economic situation, they go together. With the Great Depression, there was no money available for research and development during the 30s to upgrade military equipment. And in fact, the thinking was, well, we got to use up all the stuff from World War One. The problem with military equipment and military supplies is they don't age well. So here you're
Sure.
15 years and or 20 years after World War One, and it's like you're using up all this outdated, obsolete, you know, unstable equipment because there was no money to make new equipment or munitions is the word I'm looking for. And while at the same time Germany is rapidly, creating for at the time a modern army. So you had the economic side, and then the political side is it tends to get lost in 1940, 30, well, 1940 and 41. There was a massive, strong isolationist movement in the United States for us to go back to what George Washington had said was no foreign entanglements from his second inaugural. That actually guided our foreign policy all the way up to World War One. So that had reasserted itself. So there wasn't any strong desire for us to go and get involved with another European war. Basically, because a lot of people in America felt like we had done a lot in World War One and not even it wasn't even appreciated. So you had that whole environment where it was very hard for the military to be able to modernize its equipment and come up to speed. And like I like to joke, I read somewhere where like we were 17th ranked army in the world in 1939, 1940, behind Bulgaria. So it was kind of like people just don't understand. One quick story, last story to that is uh, the Willis was trying to interest the Army in a vehicle in late 39, 1940, and Walter Short, who ended up becoming, unfortunately, one of the fall people for the Pearl Harbor, he was actually in charge of Fort Benning in 1939, 1940, before he went to Hawaii. And they went there, and he said, well, I'll see if I can find $10,000. And the guy testifying later in like 1944 goes, yeah, Walter Short said, General Short said, I'll see if I can find $10,000, which seems ridiculous now,
Hmm.
given all
Hmm.
the money we've spent in the last 4 years on this war. So that's how difficult, that was the environment that the military and the car companies were working in to try to, create basically a revolutionary new vehicle that, well, the pieces had existed, but never had existed in that combination before.
Well, so how did the eventual development of this lightweight, all-terrain reconnaissance vehicle become such a priority, considering all the upgrading, all the other upgrading needs?
Oh, another good question. Let me mention, if I can mention, the court case, okay? Because that
Sure.
forms the um, helps people understand where my answer comes from. So I go to the archives, and I'd heard about, I'm finding material, in folders and this and that, and letters and memos and this, and I'd heard about this court case. I don't even remember where I'd heard about it. Right? It was called the Federal Trade Commission in the matter of Willis Overland Motors Inc. and United States Advertising um, corporation. And they're like, so I'm there the second day, and I said, well, why don't I look at this court case and see if it has anything? I have no idea what I'm about to do, right? So I asked the archivist, greatest people in the world, archivist, so helpful. He says, oh, yes, Mr. Bruno, we have that court case here. It's in, I just fill out this slip and we'll bring it out for you. I'm like, okay, what greatest country in the world, right? Complete nobody just goes to the archives and they're like, yeah, sure, we'll bring out this court case for you. They bring it out, and it's like they have it on a cart, and it's like 30 boxes, okay? 30 boxes, 8.5 by 11, that can hold 8.5 by 11 inch paper. Well, long story short, going through it then, and then later on, I come to realize it has 3,547 pages of testimony and 512 exhibits. Okay. And long story short, I come to realize this court case is a complete and total documentation how the Jeep was developed. It was the testimony is a massive oral history of by all that they deposed all the people who had anything to do in 1940 and 1941 with the creation and development of the Jeep, from Willis, from Ford, from Bantam, and from the Army and other people. Okay. And they asked them every question in the book because the court case was about is Willis was saying they had created the Jeep in 1940 in their advertising. And the Federal Trade Commission sues them saying that was false advertising. So they went in to determine how the Jeep had come about. Well, I'm reading this as an historian, right? And I'm like, this is a massive oral history telling from the people who did it, okay, only a few years afterwards, not decades afterwards, where they're trying to remember. And the other side of it as an oral history is, someone may ask me something I did 40 years ago, and I may or may not remember that well. And then if I do, I may embellish what I did. Well, these people are in a court case. They can't lie because they could be charged with perjury. So it's one of the most massive, pure oral histories I could ever imagine, right? And I'm like, oh my God, right? So, and then all the exhibits are there, all numbered and explained in the testimony, all the major exhibits, I mean, historic stuff of here is like the first drawing of a Jeep, Bantam's bid proposal, Willis's proposal in 1940, all the key memos and documents. So this is like, I'm like reading it like it's 70 years later. Now it's 80 years later. And I'm like, why hasn't anybody ever gone through this court case and found out what this really is, right? I copied 3,000 pages, read all of it, and I'm the only one that's ever done that. That's what makes my book unique. Because what I did is I organized all the material from the court case, all the testimony, into a comprehensive narrative, but I allowed the people who were there, their testimony to tell what they did, why they did it, when they did it, and how they did it. So to answer your question, from the court case, I'm reading through Ingemar Oseth's testimony. He was an infantry colonel, okay? And he had been involved with getting vehicle testing in the infantry in the late 1930s at Fort Benning, where they were trying to solve this problem of mobility with moving troops in small payloads. So he really knew a lot about vehicles. He got transferred to Washington in early 1940, and since he had this expertise in vehicles, they put him on the Motor Transport Committee at the quartermaster, who would be the ones to procure vehicles. Well, he goes to this three-day conference where they talk about various vehicle problems. And one of them is we don't have a small, lightweight vehicle to move troops and small payloads, the exact problem we're talking about.
Yeah.
3 days they talk about this, and this is late May, literally 10 days after Hitler had invaded the Low Countries in France. He did that May 10th, 1940. It's like May 20th to 22nd, 1940. And they come to the conclusion that we have absolutely nothing to solve this problem. We have absolutely nothing on the drawing board. Nothing. Zip. Nada. Right? Now, he was this conference was at Camp Holabird, Maryland, which was outside of Baltimore. Right? So he had just driven up from Washington. So he drives back to Washington, walks into the War Department, and walks into his office. And sitting in his office window is Charles Payne from the Bantam Company, trying to meet with him to interest him in developing. Actually, he wanted to meet with a guy named Robert Howie, which is explained in the book. And Oseth says, why are you here? He goes, well, I want to meet with Robert Howie about building a small vehicle for the military. And he goes, Robert Howie's not your guy. I'm your guy. So he's just sitting in the window, right? 3 days, literally when Oseth comes back from this conference, it's literally miraculous. And they meet. And after Oseth tells him, this isn't going to work, I know what we need. And over the next 2 weeks, they develop a memo, which is the June 6, 1940 memo, which we talk about with 9 characteristics, just basically outlining what the Jeep would be, what this vehicle would be like. And they named it the quarter ton, because they thought it should weigh about 1,300 pounds, the quarter ton 4x4 light. That's how we got that thing. And that's how the whole Jeep procurement started. When I was looking for material before I had the court case to give me all the perspective of how all this stuff happened, I couldn't find anything about the quarter ton 4x4 light before June 6, 1940. Well, the reason was that memo kicked off the entire procurement for the Jeep. And I held that memo in my hands. It's like massively historic. So there you go. There, it's like first, I always say this, Ernest, every single time I talk about this for 20 years, at least the last 10 or 12 since I've written the books. You can't make that up. You can't make that up. It's like, and it's like, it just says, how did that happen? So that was the start of the Jeep procurement.
But you also mentioned that this type of vehicle and those desired characteristics had already been considered as early as 1935 by Lieutenant Homer Hamilton, who created a rudimentary design. What happened to his design?
It just never took off because of he was in the cavalry, and that was the interesting thing is infantry was looking for a vehicle, cavalry was looking for a lightweight vehicle, field artillery, ordnance. They really needed an all-around vehicle to solve this problem mobility, which would make the requirements very difficult because each branch might have a little bit different requirements. It just going back to our original discussion, not enough money, not enough interest. Hitler, Roosevelt and his administration, they prioritized in his first term from 33 to 37 domestic policy completely. No foreign policy, no military, no anything, because they really didn't see the threat coming. It wasn't to 38, 39, solidly into his second term where they started to say, we've got a threat here. We need to start spending some money on the military. So that's why Homer Hamilton's, and I found that a cavalry article in the court case, they had put it in there to go exactly what you're saying. Here's a little bit of the genesis, and that's what I call that chapter in the book, of where the Jeep vehicle came about. So they were talking about it, and then the other side of it was I found out it wasn't in the court case, but I found a whole bunch of reports and memos of the infantry's testing in the late 1930s that OSETH had considered. So all that stuff's in the book. Again, detail and background that isn't found anywhere else. So that's why it didn't really. They had fits and starts, but they really didn't get going until that June 6, 1940 memo. I apologize. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Right. All right. So we have the stage set for someone to take the lead in this badly needed project. And that's where these three automotive manufacturers come in: the American Bantam Car Company, the Willis Overland Company, and the Ford Motor Company. Who was American Bantam Car Company? How did it wind up with this very important role in creating the Jeep?
Well, that is a really good question because no one's ever heard of the American Bantam Car Company. The short version is there was a guy, and I had this all detailed in chapter 2 of the book. I found all the stuff that could possibly be found out there. There was an old book called Whatever Happened to Baby Austin, written in the 1960s, which talked about American Bantam and American Austin. I found that book online. I have it in my office, as a fellow book lover. And I also found a few other resources on American Bantam. But basically what happened was a guy from England decided he wanted to build small cars in America. And now this is in the early days of the automotive industry. So he comes over in the late 20s. It was called the Austin 7. And he starts a company right at the beginning of the Great Depression called the American Austin Company. And he wanted to build small cars. Well, nobody wanted small cars. American Austin goes bankrupt. In the mid-30s, there's a guy named Roy Evans, who was a car dealer, car guy to his bones. He decided to buy the remnants of the American Austin Company, and he renamed it the American Bantam, and he tried to build these small cars again. But by 1940, nobody still wanted the small cars, and the firm was bankrupt again and going out, okay? And so that's why they hired Charles Payne, actually, because the factory was at a standstill. They were going to try to build aircraft parts, and he was in the War Department in the Army because the Air Force was still under the Army in 1940. Didn't become its own branch until after World War II, 1947. So American Bantam, that's why Charles Payne was in OSES's office. They were the singular company in America that had expertise in building small vehicles. So what happened was, Payne's working with OSESF, and so Payne's representing the Bantam Company, right? So OSESF what had happened, and this is the detail that comes out in the court case that's nowhere else in my book, and I love this story because it's like this stuff never happens, right? The year before, the infantry had gone to the quartermaster and said, we want this particular vehicle. And the quartermaster botched the entire procurement. So the infantry is furious at the quartermaster for not getting the right vehicle. So when they created this memo, Oseth put in, and if you read the memo, you go down, it's like 9 general characteristics. One of the characteristics is a armored face shield for the driver. It'd be like, why would you put an armored face shield in a lightweight vehicle? It's supposed to be 1,300 pounds, right? Which nobody could build a vehicle for 1,300 pounds. That's a whole other issue, the weight. In the trial, he testifies. We would never have known this if he hadn't been testifying in this trial. Buried in his testimony, he says, well, I put that requirement for an armored face shield so that the procurement would go to the ordnance department and not the quartermaster, because at that time there was this unique rule that if anything had armor in it, the ordnance department would make it. Well, in June of 1940, the ordnance department has a meeting, and this is how that meeting went, Ernest. Never have a meeting like this anymore. They all looked around and went, we have no idea how to produce a vehicle. That's what the quartermaster does. Why are we doing this? So how about we go to the Bantam factory in Butler and see if they can help us figure out what we're trying to do here. So they put together a whole team, whole committee to go to Butler from the ordnance department to kind of see how to figure out what this vehicle might be like, because Bantam, obviously Payne was involved. They also it was still a small enough industry where they knew Bantam was the only one that had the expertise to take basically an idea and turn it into something that could maybe be put on paper and built to. But I love that story. He's like, and he called it a lawyer's trick. He's right in a full room full of lawyers in a trial. He calls it a lawyer's trick, where I basically did something underhanded so it would go to ordnance because we didn't want the quartermaster to mess up for us again. Luckily, all that stuff never happens anymore between departments and organizations. So I just another one of those, you can't make that up. So that's how Bantam became central at the beginning of the project. A bankrupt company who had no resources, nothing, was basically 1 inch from going out, became central to the early development of the Jeep.
But as you point out, the Quartermaster's Corps had adopted a policy of standardization, a policy that evolved from major issues experienced in the First World War, but it wasn't a policy that was necessarily approved or supported by other military departments, and for sure not by private manufacturers. That kind of complicated matters for this kind of a product, didn't it?
Exactly, and they had because they had so little money at the time. The rule at the quartermaster and the Army was, we got to procure things from commercial manufacturers, whatever it is. We're not going to build it ourselves, okay? And so what happened was, they go to Butler, and over 2 days, they really sketch out a little bit more what the vehicle's going to be about. And here's another story that's only in my book. Online, I would see this sketch of that people would say, we believe this is the first sketch of an early Jeep, the Jeep, of what would become the Jeep. But we don't know who did it, where they did it, why they did it, how they did it, right? Well, I'm in the court case, and I get to exhibit like 160, and I pull it out. It's that very sketch. I'm holding a copy of that sketch. It's either the original or a copy of this sketch, which is supposedly the first sketch of a Jeep-like vehicle. I'm holding that in my hands. That's like you're holding history in your hands, right? So then I go and read the testimony, and what happened was Frank Finn, who was the president of the Bantam Company, he gave a detailed recounting of what happened on both those days, June 19th and 20th of 1940, when the Army came. Again, information nowhere else from the guy that was there saying, the Army arrived, we did this. The Army, then we did this, then we did this, then we did this. And then at the end of this 8, 9, 10 paragraph description, which is in the book, a massively important day in Jeep history, June 19th, 1940, he says, at the end of the day, Mr. Brown and Mr. Beasley took a yellow scratch pad, and never forget this, indicating, so he's pointing to a yellow scratch pad in the courtroom. It says they drew a sketch of what they thought the vehicle would be like and look like. And it's that sketch. But now instead of saying we don't know who did it, where they did it, why they did it, and how they did it, we know exactly when they did it, exactly who did it, exactly why they did it, and where it fits in. And it is the first sketch. But if you didn't have Frank Fenn's testimony, which lay buried for 70 years until I come bumbling along, like who the heck am I, to figure that out. So yeah, so basically to answer your question, it's they basically had to come up with, from the ordnance department, a general idea what would happen. And then just to finish that point off, when they went back, they said, this isn't going to have an armored face shield. And the ordnance department said, yeah, the higher ups got involved and said, no, this is a quartermaster procurement. So OSES lawyer's trick didn't fail. Within 3 weeks, it was over the quartermaster department, and it went on from there.
Well, you just like from this point, as they're trying to develop some sort of idea of what the characteristics would be, then pushing through American Bantam's proposal became a marathon. Can you summarize the kinds of hoops and the type and the number of hoops the company had to jump to get to the point where Army representatives would even begin preliminary discussions?
Yeah, that's another really good question. The hoops and what happened next after the June 19th, 20th conference, short version is they go back, it goes to the quartermaster. Now, anyone that's been involved in government procurements, maybe any procurements, military procurements, they usually don't move very quickly. Within 3 weeks, they developed a concept drawing, which I have in the book. I held that in my hands, a body assembly drawing, and a 17-page specification called ES 475, which a manufacturer could build a vehicle to. 3 weeks. The quartermaster working with Bantam. They sent that out. They decided to do a bid, which Bantam wasn't prepared for, and they sent it out to 135 companies. Bantam thought they were going to get a negotiated contract. Well, Bantam doesn't have any resources. So they basically have to go hire a guy and have him drive in from Detroit named Carl Probst to help them put their bid together, okay? They put their bid together. Now, Willis, the second company, they get the bid. They had no idea it was coming. They wanted it extended. This whole stuff around the bid in 1940 is a complete, it's a complete mess, right? So Bantam is trying to scramble to put their bid together. Willis is trying to put their bid together. And the Army gave them, for a revolutionary new vehicle, which no one had ever created, that no one had ever seen before, right, other than this concept drawing 08370-C in ES 475. They gave them 10 days to put a proposal together. Excuse me. Well, Bantam whips their proposal together, and I actually had their bid proposal, one of the most historic documents in Jeep history. It's in the court case, their entire bid proposal, right? Now, let me tell you a story around that. So the Army, now I'm a project manager also. I worked as a project manager, so you got to gather requirements, right? So one of the major requirements is the weight. So they decided, well, how, Ernest, you say, how did they decide the weight, Mr. Bruno? Great question. Here's how they decided the weight without asking any expert who would build the vehicle how much it probably would weigh. They said, well, this is supposed to be replaced between the motorcycle and sidecar, which weighs 500 pounds, and the half-ton truck, which weighs 2,000 pounds. So this is miraculously going to weigh 1,300 pounds. Well, nobody could build a vehicle no one could build a vehicle what they wanted in the specification at 1,300 pounds. And I detail that in the book, the whole weight problem through really February 1941. It was a massive problem. So that ends up in this great story, right? Which again, I found in a Automotive Quarterly article from 1976 by Carl Probst, the engineer they brought in to help them put their bid to. Long story short, Carl Probst is an honest engineer. They put their whole bid proposal together, and he puts in the weight box, this little box, number 6 on this 17-page specification, 1,850 pounds. They go and meet with the aforementioned Charles Payne the night before, July 21st, 1940. The night before, they're going to submit their bid in the morning on July 22nd. And Charles Payne is going through the bid proposal and blows a gasket. It says, you can't say this is going to weigh 1,850 pounds. They'll eliminate us immediately. So they bring in a stenographer in the middle of the night and they retype the whole bid proposal. And Probst remembers this. He's recounting this 22 years later. He says we put 1,273 pounds in for the weight. And he's saying in his recollection, he goes, I have no idea. He goes, Probst, Payne went nuts and he wanted to do this. And I'm thinking to myself, what kind of procurement is this? But I didn't say anything. So basically, they're lying through their teeth saying they could build this to 1,273 pounds. Well, I pull out, man, 75 years later, I pull out that bid proposal in the court case, a copy of it, right? And I look at the weight, and I had read that story before I went to the archives. I look at the weight, and in the weight box, it says 1,273 pounds. He had remembered the exact number 22 years later, right? So and then the other qualification they wanted that Willis objected to both the weight was they wanted it built in 49 days. And Willis basically said, that's impossible. We could do it in 75 days. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Bantam, we're bankrupt. We've got nothing. If we don't get this contract, we're going out. Yeah, we can build it in 49 days. They had no idea if they could build it in 49 days. So that's one of the great ethical questions. It makes a great ethical question. Well, would you lie basically and say on a bid proposal to the government you could build this to 1,273 pounds? Because basically Probst said to Frank Fenn, don't worry about the weight requirement. Nobody can build it to that. We'll get that figured out later. So that's where you stand in July, the whole mismatch. And it's just this one miraculous, thing after another from, basically when Oseth met Payne all the way to now we're what? 2 months, they've gone in and now they're going out and getting bids. 2 months to try to build this vehicle. So that's where we stand in July of 1940. So, and that's when Willis came back into the procurement, was when they tried to bid for the get the contract to build the first 70 vehicles.
Yeah, but it seems to me that with Willis, Overland, and Ford later on getting involved, that American Bantam did most of the heavy lifting in the design work, as you described, where their company personnel used a Bantam chassis and then sketched the body in chalk on the concrete factory floor, and the engineers would then make a mock-up of a wooden or cardboard model. I mean, am I correct in saying that this is how the fundamental concept of that vehicle was developed?
You are absolutely correct. And that was all the court case. How they came up with the specification ES475, a chalk floor, a wooden mock-up. And yes, that early Jeep history can be broken down into 3 periods, like the end of World War I to October 1940, October 1940 to about March 1941, then March 1941 to the end of 1941. And going to your point, which is absolutely correct, Bantam was really the driving force with the Army in that first period through October 1940. They were the ones that helped, that came up with the concept in June. They were the ones that a guy named Harold Christ, who I'm glad I have a chance to mention, who doesn't get the credit he deserves in history for what he did here with the Jeep, developed the Jeep. They've developed the specifications to build the first one. Bantam was involved with that besides the quartermaster engineers. And Bantam really did. See, people say, well, especially even the Jeep division, they all focus on Willis, right? And even Jeep starts Jeep history in 1941, which if I had a chance to chat with them, I'd say no. And they really downplay Bantam's involvement. I don't know why. Yeah. That's their business, But Bantam was that driving force in the beginning where, I know what the point I was going to make. People there, and I don't know if it's this old animosity or competition from 80 years ago, but the way I look at it is, and it really helps answer your question, is the birthplace of the Jeep is really Butler, Pennsylvania. The birthplace. Okay. Yeah. That's where it really came to gestation in terms of being able to create a vehicle. And they built the first one there in Butler, okay, over the summer of 1940. But what I like to say is Toledo and Willis, they're the home of the Jeep. Over the course of the Jeep procurement, Willis ended up, ascending. They won the contract in 1941 to build the first 16,000. They ended up, creating the MB, which was a phenomenal Jeep. And so I like to say Toledo and Willis, they're the home of the Jeep. You can be born someplace, But if you move early in your life, your home is really somewhere else. And that's really what happened here. And I don't know why they still have this animosity. There's enough glory to go around for both, where basically, Butler is the birthplace of the Jeep and American Bantam, and Willis is the ones that evolved the Jeep into what it would be for the war, and they're the home of the Jeep. So, but you're absolutely right. Bantam in that first period of time up through October 1940, they basically are the ones that, I don't like to say invented, because they basically took a whole lot of concepts that were out there in piecemeal and put them into one vehicle, which you see on the front of the book, the Bantam number 1, that had never really existed before. So yeah, Bantam was, and I don't understand it. Nobody remembers who the second person who was who landed on the moon. Everybody always remembers the first, right? It was Buzz Aldrin was the second, but it's Neil Armstrong. And if you look at anything in history, almost all the time, the one that gets the credit is whoever did it first, right? Well, there's always an exception, and really, in 85 years of Jeep history, Bantam built the first Jeep, but they really don't get. People should know Bantam just, well, Jeep. Oh yeah, first one was built by American Bantam. Nope, because during the war and then after the war and even up to now, they really don't. The Jeep, Willis really was able to downplay Bantam's involvement after the war. Willis didn't want that to be really out there, because Willis decided was building the Jeeps after the war, and then that just has continued to this day. So I've tried to do the best to show what all three of them did, which all three made major contributions, Bantam, Ford, and Willis, to what eventually became the Willis MB, to each get the credit they deserve.
Well, what was Willis's history? And I mean, it didn't come into the picture until the 135 requests for proposal was mailed out. That kind of threw a curveball at Bantam, I think. But I mean, did the Willis Overland version have any outstanding advantages over Bantam?
Well, here's what happened, Ernest. This is another one of those, you can't make this story up, right? So Willis goes to the July 22nd conference, Bantam's proposal was typed out, was beautiful. They had a handwritten bid proposal, which wasn't bad given they only had 10 days. Well, they were honest. They said it would take us 75 days to build the vehicle. So the procurement officer, Major Laws, this is like, you go buy a car. They put all their bids in. He went in the back. I got to talk to my supervisor, right? Oh, it's a car deal. Never changes, right? He comes back out and he says, well, Willis has the low bid. And Bantam, the people in Bantam, they like almost faint, right? It's like 90 degrees there in July at Camp Holoburn in a non-air conditioned office, right? Then the guy says, but Willis says they can't build the vehicle until 75 days. And Bantam says they can build it in 49 days, when, as we already talked, they're basically lying through the teeth. They had no idea if they could do it or not. And so with penalty, the award goes to Bantam. So that's how this close Bantam came to be, not even getting the contract for the first 70. So after that happens, the Army the next day, now what was going on at that time was, because they had no money in the 30s, they had this kind of gray area policy where companies could build pilot models or prototypes of things on their own dime and give it to the military, and they would look at it. So the quartermaster calls Willis. The quartermaster calls Willis in after they've been now given this contract to Bantam, and says, "Hey, we got a deal for you. If you want to build a prototype on your own dime and submit it, we'll take a look at it." And Willis wanted
what a great deal.
What a great deal. Willis wanted this business so bad, they undertook that challenge. That's how they got back into, after their first almost near-death experience, they had 3 of them, where they were out, okay? The Army sends them this lifeline, and that's how they got back in. So in parallel, over the summer and into the fall of 1940, Bantam, unbeknownst to Bantam, they did this. They didn't tell Bantam that they'd given this deal to Willis, right? So Bantam thinks they have a single contract. They build their vehicle, deliver it, and to answer for your again, can't make this stuff up. Why make a great movie? They delivered their vehicle on the 49th day with a half an hour to spare. Bam. Right? 48 days, 23 and a half hours, right? And they drive through Camp Holoburn at 4:30 on September 23rd, 1940, the 49th day, and deliver their Jeep. Can't make that up, right? Great movie. Willis it didn't deliver their vehicle to November 13th, but they built the vehicle based upon the body drawing in ES 475, and they called the Willis Quad, and that's how they were reinstated back in the Jeep procurement for the first time. So by then, what happened was the quartermaster, like I worked in government, many government agencies, big is better. Banner's bankrupt. They barely have a plant going. Willis has one plant. And these people, there was a Ford bias, for lack of a better term, in the quartermaster. They called Ford up in October 1940 and asked them to come down for a meeting. The quartermaster. Ford had been at the bid opening in July 22nd, and another place, Crosley, and both of them said, we're not even going to bid because we couldn't build this in 49 days of our life depended on it. Okay, we can't do it. And we can't do it for the way. So they call Ford back in October, and the quartermaster hands them all the updated documentation, all the documented drawings, and says, will you build the vehicle for us so we can take a look at it? And Ford did. Delivered it on November 21st, 1940. Now, they built theirs in 5 or 6 weeks, but they had all Banham and Willis's experience already involved, and Banham's vehicle was already existed, and they actually took them out and let them look at it, okay, because it was a government procurement. Nothing's a secret, right, except when it is a secret. And so that's how Ford got involved. The quartermaster asked them to get involved. So now, and then during the second, that's why I call the second period of early Jeep history from October 1940 to March, April 1941, there was a whole bunch of machinations that went around in terms of eventually landing on, in the early spring of 1941, each vendor had a contract to build 1,500 experimental models of their Jeep for the Army to test. They went from 70 from Banham and all this machinations I detail in the book, which is fascinating. It's drama on steroids, okay, which they're trying to figure all this stuff out in the fall and into the winter of 1941. They came up with Banham's going to get a contract to build 1,500. Willis is going to get a contract to build 1,500, and we'll give Ford a contract to build 1,500 because you know why? It's just taxpayer money. Why not? And I have all that detail nowhere else of how that all came about, where they got to build their 1,500 experimental models.
So. But through all of that part of the process, the weight problem rears its ugly head. I mean, especially for Willis, they couldn't guarantee a weight of what was it? Try to get it under 2,200 pounds, because Willis wanted to go with its bigger engine, the Go Devil, as you call it. What did that mean for Willis trying to get their test model out?
Oh, that is like the massive focal point of that second period of early Jeep history is the weight requirement, what Willis went through. So Banham, they're testing the Banham. So here's the first thing on the weight, right? And Banham's weighs about 1,800 pounds. They're out testing it at Camp Holderberg, right? And so these two generals are driving, and it gets stuck in the mud. And they get out of the vehicle, and Carl Probst was there, and Charles Payne was there. And the generals say, how much does this weigh? And Carl Probst, being this honest engineer, starts giving him an explanation, and Payne's like hitting him in the side, going, man, don't tell him how much it weighs, because it doesn't weigh anywhere near 1,300 pounds. So the two generals go, this is October 1940. If me and my other general, if we can lift this out of this mud, weight's good to go. So they lift it out of the mud. They go, yeah, we could do it. Weight's good to go. Doesn't matter. It weighs 1,800 pounds, not 1,300 pounds, right? So Willis, yes, this is one of those fateful decisions that is historic decisions. Their vice president of engineering, I'm glad I got a chance to mention his name, Delmar Roos. Famous guy, should be like household name in Jeep history. He had been in England before, right up to 1939, and had moved back. So he'd seen the war clouds and everything going on in Europe. He had been involved with, throughout his career, the development of military vehicles. He knew more power in a military vehicle is never wasted. So he got this horrible weight requirement. They get the bid thing. They had this Go Devil engine, which was a Willis engine. They knew the engine. They knew how it performed. I have details about that engine in my book from Roos's testimony. Nowhere else. How many RPMs it did, blah, 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 how they tested it, how they built it. So He said, we are going to use that engine because we know that engine, we can design to that engine. Well, that just put them massively overweight, right? So going to one of the key decisions in that period, that second period of time. So what happened was, real quick, the Army had everything planned out when in this whole procurement. So when Bantam finished their vehicle came in and it tested beyond their wildest dreams, right? They looked around and said, well, now what do we do? They had no idea. They hadn't planned for that, right? So they have a meeting and they go, well, why don't we get 500 from Bantam? And they're like, okay. Then they had more meetings and it was like, that's not enough. So why don't we give 1,500 to Bantam? All right. It's only taxpayer money. So then Willis and Ford, and the only reason they were giving that to Bantam is Bantam had a submitted and approved prototype. And you're supposed to, before you can get a contract, you're supposed to have an approved and submitted prototype. That's the rule, right? Well, Willis and Ford's prototypes were in, but they hadn't been tested, right? So in November, December, they had this huge firestorm where Willis and Ford said, no, we should get a contract too. Well, lo and behold, by December, they all said, yeah, even though Willis and Ford don't have a approved prototype, yeah, they get 1,500 too. So that's how we got the 1,500. That's all detailed in the book. In January 1940, Ford's Pygmy, which I don't know if you know this or not, still exists. The third Jeep ever built still exists. It's in Huntsville, Alabama, right? Won't bore you with that story. But anybody wants to see the third Jeep ever built, go to the Veterans Memorial Museum in Huntsville, Alabama, right? So Ford's Pygmy, boom, great Jeep, gets approved. Go build your 1,500. Willis is so overweight and their vehicle did not do well in the testing. They have a meeting in late January 1941 and basically say, Willis is not getting a contract until they get the weight down, and we totally recommend that they get rid of their engine and get another engine because it's too heavy. Well, Willis went right to the top, and through political machinations, that was January 21st. By February 3rd, the assistant chief of staff to George Marshall wrote a memo and said, well, guess what? Doesn't matter that Willis's prototype didn't pass testing. Yeah, we're giving him the 1,500 contract anyway. So that was the second near-death experience where Willis was almost out of the Jeep procurement, and basically it was basically a political intervention. They basically said, we're going to break all the rules. You don't have your prototype did not pass testing. You need to redesign the whole thing, but we're going to give you the contract for 1,500 anyways because we want to keep you in. That's called making it up as you go along.
Flying by the seat of their pants, boy.
Oh, we got one more story if we have time for it later on, where Willis almost went out 3 times, okay, which was an historic decision. But so by March 1941, you have 3 competitors, and they're going to build so their originals were called prototypes or pilot models. Now they're going to build 1,500 what they called experimental models of their vehicles for the Army to be able to test in 1941. So that's where we stand in March of 41 at the end of the second period of early Jeep history. So.
Okay, so those pilot models then were provided and went through some really extensive testing. I got a kick out of some of those photos where the military personnel sitting in any of the various pilot models were going flying over the hills, and they're like in midair. So that was kind of funny to see. But what happened? What was the eventual outcome there?
Yeah, that's you see all those photographs, and it's what's nice about my book is you see the vehicle coming to life from nothing through the first drawing, through the body assembly drawing, and then I met a guy, he's since passed away, who Bantam took photographs, and if you have the book, you read it, of them building the first Jeep, historic stuff. And he allowed me to use those photographs in the build chapter for Bantam, so you see the very first one actually being built, right?
Yeah.
So then you get to the point where you're at, where all of a sudden I think it's good to have 20-year-olds driving this thing because they're the ones that would fly over hills. Like I can't speak for you, but at my age, I wouldn't be flying over any hills. All right, so. So what happened was, but let's now focus in a little bit on the Willis story. Bantam built their 1,500, sent them out to test. Ford built their 1,500. Ford renamed their prototype the GP, and G stood for government, and P stood for a vehicle with an 80-inch wheelbase. Bantam named their original vehicle the Bantam reconnaissance car. It wasn't called a Jeep. It was called the
Yeah.
Bantam reconnaissance car. Jeep name got put to the quarter-ton vehicles, Willis, Ford, and Bantam, over the time period of the fall 1940, 1941. Nobody really knows how or why, but just I know I started to call them Jeeps. Okay, I tried to explain a little bit of that in my book. So Willis, they go back, and I have detail on this. It's nowhere else from the testimony of how they basically took the quad and painstakingly redesigned it, and it took them to May 1941 to get it done into the MA, where the Army had decided in February 1941, this thing really needs to weigh 2,160 pounds, but they never renamed it to the half-ton truck, right? 4x4. They still called it the quarter-ton 4x4 light for its whole history, even though now it's really weighing half a ton, right? But the reason I think that is that's what everybody knew it as, the quarter ton. So they didn't want to change the nomenclature because they were so far into it, even though the weight was now. So with that 2,160 pounds, Willis made a decision where the Army, I have the actual memo where the Army states, and I have it in bold in the book, you need to replace the engine. They went back, and Delmar Roos testified and said, I had meetings with Frazier. These probably were some pretty heated meetings, right? And he said, we decided, which is probably Delmar Roos, we're going to live or die by our engine. Because I know that because their engine was 60 horsepower, and the other two engines, because they tried to make the weight, and the Ford and the Bantam were 40 horsepower. And he was going to keep that extra horsepower, which I believe was a massively fateful historic decision, because that extra 20 horsepower in the war probably proved very, very helpful in all the places the Jeep ended up. Delmar Roos, one guy. So anyway, long story longer, as my wife used to say, but I'll try to keep it short. So they went out, and I found all this documentation on the testing. That was the key in 1941, was where to test these vehicles. And I have a whole chapter on their testing, both the Bantam, the Ford, and the Willis, and 3 different test reports and things of that nature, so people get a sense of how detailed they went in to test those experimental models. Well, in late June 1940, and this is the fateful stuff that happens, orders, and I have this from the testimonies, orders came down from the chief of staff. I don't know if the Russia invasion was just about to happen, or things were really speeding up, but the chief of staff, George Marshall, through his subordinate, said, I want Ingemar Oseth and a guy named Colonel Van Dusen to go to Fort Knox and Fort Benning and find out what's going on with this. By now they knew it called the Jeep development. So they go to Benning in late June 1940. They go to Knox, and I have all detail from Oseth's testimony. What happened, what they did, what they talked about, the whole thing. They come back and they update the Jeep specification in late June 1940. Okay, and I had that specification in my research. I didn't put it in the book. I actually have in the appendices, nowhere else can people find these, ES 475 in detail. I typed the whole thing in by hand because it was all PDFs. That specification, the test reports for Bantam, things that don't exist anywhere else that I have in my research, I put in the appendices of the book for people to see this. So they come back to Washington, and orders come down in late June 1941. We want this vehicle, and we want it now. Quartermaster, go out and procure 16,000 of these. So the quartermaster says, okay, how about we give a negotiated contract to Ford? Now there was this, and it's in the book, this Office of War Production, I think it was called. And it was headed by a guy named William Knudsen, who no one's ever heard of. He was a hugely important person that day. He'd been a Ford executive. Then he worked for GM. Didn't really like Henry Ford, as I recall. He was pulled. This is what they were doing in 1940 and 40. They were pulling people from industry to help for the buildup for the war because they knew it was coming, especially after Roosevelt was reelected in fall 1940. So Knudsen's in the government now, out of private sector, and he's part of this thing which oversees the war procurement. So the quartermaster has to go to him and his agency to get approval for that. And Knudsen says, no, we have 3 vendors. You need to do a bid, okay? So they go out and hastily put a bid together. Now, 16,000. Now think of this. In a year, they go from we only need 70 of these things to we need 16,000. And the original contract for Bantam was 175,000. That's all they could scrape together in 1940. Well, I have the actual contract that they signed with Willis, who ended up winning the bid, and I'll explain how that happened in the third, another miraculous story. $12 million for 16,000 of these things, right? So they go from 175,000 a year to 12 million, right? So here's what happens. They send the bid out. Willis, Bantam, Ford, and Checker Cab Company submit bids. Checker's immediately eliminated. It comes down to Bantam, Ford, or Willis. Well, remember I mentioned that the quartermaster had a Ford bias? They write a 4-page memo, which I included in the book. Basically, here's the summation of this 4-page memo. Ford walks on water, and Bantam and Willis are horrible. That's the summation of the 4-page memo. And they're going to award the 16,000 contract to Ford to build the Ford GP, right? The contract goes up to Knudsen, right? One guy, change in history. And he says, no, we're not going to award this to Ford because Willis has the lowest price. And at that time, they kind of thought the Willis MA was an amazing Jeep, that they basically had the better vehicle. Now, Knudsen made his decision on the price because technically you're supposed to go with the low bidder, and Willis had the lowest bid. Luckily, they also had the best vehicle. So one guy intervenes for the third time that Willis was going to be out of the Jeep procurement and saves them again. So they were out in July 1940. The quartermaster throws them a lifeline. They're out again with the weight problem in February 1941, and the assistant chief of staff says, yeah, we're just going to break all the rules and keep Willis in. And here Knudsen overrules the quartermaster and says the 16,000 goes to Willis. And I had the memo that after the quartermaster got that, they had to rewrite an approval memo. And in the memo, people are very mature. They accept things. Literally, it's like 16-year-olds where the quartermaster says, you made us do this. Here's the memo to approve it, and we hate you. Knudsen, right? And I put that memo in the book because it's so important. So that's how you got in the overview and all the details of the book to now Willis has the MA. They call Willis in August of 1941. They went all these changes, which we document in the book, okay? And they made so many changes. So how did you get to the Willis MA? You had the Willis Quad, because they called it the Quad, I think, because it was 4x4. Well, when they redesigned the whole thing. They said, well, this is a military vehicle, and it's the first version, so we'll give it a letter. So the first letter of the alphabet is A. So that's how they came up with the MA, right? So they made all these changes to it in the fall of 1941 before they began production on the 16,000. And they said, there's so many changes to this. This was not really the MA, so it's the second version. So the second letter of the alphabet is, wait for it, Ernest, I went to school, B. So that's how they got the Willis MB, okay? And I have detail in the book of the changes that they made after the awarding of the contract. Telmar Roos testified 15 pages of changes. I put 10 in the book. I'm typing in the changes, and I'm like, okay, these 10 will give people a sense of how much changes they were making from what they had been on for 16,000 to what they eventually built. Again, stuff you can't find anywhere else. So 3 times Willis was out of the. You would never have had a Willis MB. 3 times they were dead and resurrected. It's miraculous. Can't make that up. Go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
So that the Willis MB eventually gets designated as the official standard, but Ford is designated as the official alternate manufacturing source under license from Willis. So it looks like Bantam's role was terminated because the quartermaster didn't want to take the chance on that company's delivery promises because it only had the single car factory. So Bantam just faded out of the picture.
Exactly. You made 2 really good points there. One on the Bantam side, as 41 kept going, they had a very good Jeep. Bantam's BRC 40, their eventual. It was a solid Jeep, but they were bankrupt. They were small. They were in Butler. People back then, you built cars in Detroit, and the military, as the war grew bigger and bigger and bigger, and you see in the original documentations, reading them, the dawning over that year period between July 40 and 41, these people had never experienced anything of the magnitude they were about to get into. Never. Even World War I wasn't even close. And you could see it in their thinking. So by summer 1941, even if Bantam had the lowest price, the quartermaster would have said, you don't have the production facilities to do it. That was probably the right decision. People say Bantam got, messed over or, I don't know if I can say we're kind of screwed out of things, but really it made the most sense that they really weren't chosen, even though they had a good vehicle. And Willis's vehicle was better with that Go Devil engine in it. Man, it was the better vehicle and at the lowest price. Now, the fact that Willis got all this largesse to be able to stay in the procurement to get to the point where they got the contract for the 16,000 miraculously, that's a whole other thing people can argue in history. But yeah, Bantam was kind of the game of musical chairs. They were out. Well, what happened was, I love this story. This is one of my, I mean, of all my stories, I love this final story of the Jeep procurement. So they awarded Bantam, Willis has one factory. They're going to build 16,000. Well, they look around within 2 or 3 weeks, and in late September, like what, a month, 6 weeks after they had awarded the contract 16,000, and said, it's like Jaws. We're going to need a bigger boat, right? They're looking around going, we're going to need a whole lot more of these things, right? So I love this. It's like The Godfather. They go to Willis and go, we're going to need a few more of these vehicles, Willis. What would it take for someone to build your vehicle on their license? Because we got an offer you can't refuse, right? So they go to Willis and say, we want to see what would take, because now going to the point you made earlier, just swinging right back to, I got to say, excellent interview skills. Standardization was paramount because they had all sorts of problems in World War I with too many vehicles, too many parts, couldn't keep track of it. So these people had all been like in their 20s that were now making decisions during the World War time period. Now they're all in their 40s and 50s making these decisions for World War II. They are like OCD on steroids for standardization. So they say, how can this be done? Well, Willis writes a letter, which I included in the book, 2 pages. Here's how another manufacturer could build our vehicle under license. The quartermaster gets that. Now, look, it took them a year, right, to get to 16,000, and we can't afford anything, blah, blah, blah. The quartermaster gets that letter. Within 2 weeks, they had awarded a contract to Ford for 15,000 more to build them under license. 2 weeks. And what's another 12 million, 10 million, among friends, right? So that's how Ford got back into Jeep, but they were building the Willis MB under license, and they called their vehicle the GP, and then they called it the W. The G for government, the P as their Ford GP was 80-inch wheelbase, and the W stood for Willis. And they built, and I have detail in the book from the Ford representatives of what the armies, the lengths they went to make sure that those 2 vehicles were identical. So even if you were working on a Ford GPW in the field or Willis MB, unless you looked at the nameplate in the glove compartment to see who built it, you would have no idea. So that's how Ford got back in. Like you said, game of musical chairs out of 3. Bantam was the odd person out for. They eventually got contracts to build trailers for the war, which was nice, but it wasn't vehicles. But that's how Ford got back in, and eventually Willis built about 325,000 MBs, and Ford built about 270,000 GPWs. So pretty amazing stuff.
So what happened to the lawsuit? I mean, you got all of this information from the lawsuit, but did the FTC eventually win that lawsuit?
Yeah, that's a good question. What happened with the lawsuit was the FTC concluded that American Bantam and the Army had created the Jeep in 1940, not Willis Overland, and they told Willis Overland to cease and desist on advertising anything which says you created the Jeep. So Bantam kind of got a little, I don't know, Pyrrhic victory is not the right term, but a late victory to say you guys were the key, again, birthing it.
Yeah.
Willis, Ford, and Bantam over that time period, and we've had a good opportunity in this interview, which I really appreciate to show how after Bantam built the first one and Willis built the second one, how it evolved over time with all 3 contributing things into its eventual evolution into the MB. But yeah, Willis lost the lawsuit, but they had never brought that lawsuit and deposed all these people. And when I'm reading through the testimony is not organized in any way in terms of chronologically, like, okay, here they went all over the place. That was my contribution, was to read all of it, like 3,000 pages of the 3,500. And I'm just blessed, by God as a person of faith, that I can organize things. And I'm really good with dates and things like that. So I could see, he's testifying what happened in June 1940. Make a note. That needs to go here. Oh, now he's testifying something that happened in February 1941, that needs to go here. So my book takes all the testimony, really starting in chapter 4, when when they come up with the June 6th meeting, in May 1940, which we talked about, and lays out and takes all that testimony in chronological order. But first I do Bantam, then I go back and do, in chronological order, all of Willis's history. And then simultaneously, I do Ford's history. So that's why this book is the magnum opus in the creation and development of the Jeep in detail, because no one's ever done that. And I'll be honest, when I first started back, 25 years ago, going back to the beginning of the interview, I was a little bit, I hate to say the word Bantam biased, and Bantam was messed over and they didn't get. But as I read through all the testimony of and especially the Willis people, I really got a massive appreciation how special those people were at Willis and what they did, and even Ford. But really, it's kind of like 40-40-20. 40% Bantam, very much front-loaded. 40% Willis, very much back-loaded. And Ford was there, and they contributed, but they were not the driving force. Really, Bantam and Willis were the driving forces. And the fact that Willis ended up with the contract probably was the right thing, historically right thing to happen, given everything that happened. So I'm like, people ask me, it's like, we need to stop this, Bantam people and Willis people, they all did great things. Bantam's the birthplace of the Jeep. Butler is the birthplace of the Jeep. Toledo, absolutely designated, in my opinion, whatever that's worth, the home of the Jeep. So that's kind of
okay. So this next question is kind of related to that, and just bear with me while I kind of set it up. You mentioned that in August of 1941, a director of the National Defense Advisory Commission and Office of Production Management, a guy by the name of John Biggers, testified at the Truman Commission, which is a Senate committee investigating procurements by the military. And that commission was run by Harry Truman, who was Missouri senator at the time. And it was responsible for investigating the state of the United States defense contracts. And from what I researched, it was considered a model, a very positive model for government oversight. Biggers' testimony specifically concerned how these contracts were awarded for Jeep. And the committee supposedly saved the government billions in uncovering wartime waste and fraud, saved thousands of lives by uncovering defective equipment and unsafe conditions, and in fact, helped to shorten the war by streamlining federal contracting practices. What I found this very, very amazing and very unknown. But where do you think the development of the Jeep fit into the procurement practices of World War II?
Really penetrating question. And the Truman Commission, so they, in August 1941, after they had announced the contract for 16,000, they brought some Bantam representatives in anyway to tell their side of the story. And I guess waste, fraud, and abuse is not a new thing in government procurement, just in case anybody's wondering here. But where I think it stands is that in the Jeep procurement, they definitely straddle a lot of gray areas. Okay. Going back to the fact of all the way to the initial award where they give it to Bantam, but they go to Willis and say, why don't you build one on the side? Then they straddled the gray areas in that procurement we talked about, where it's like you don't have a tested and approved prototype, but we're going to give you a 1,500 contract anyway. That shouldn't have happened by the rules. Okay. Willis shouldn't have gotten a contract until they built the MA and the MA had been tested for anything. So they would have had to continue on their own money. But they basically, I would be honest with you, broke the rules and said, no, you get a contract. And even when they awarded the contract to Ford in November 1940, yes, the Pygmy eventually passed testing, but that wasn't the January 41. So they shouldn't have had any contract. But they got contracts in hand, which means they were going to get money. So there was another where they, were around the gray area. Then finally in the 16,000, it's the same thing. The quartermaster's bias, where they wrote that 4-page memo, they should have awarded that to Willis simply on the fact that they had the lowest price and the best vehicle. And the fact that they wrote this 4-page memo to justify a decision that basically wasn't the right decision that's why they wrote a 4-page memo. Okay. In that, so again, they were skirting the now from a waste, fraud, and abuse standpoint, I don't see where that was as much in the case as they were basically gray area or basically, if I was being honest, breaking their own rules to keep Willis in, to bring Ford in. Yeah, I mean, what gave them the right in October 1940 basically called Ford up and said, we want you to build us a prototype. You know, they hadn't bid, they weren't even interested in Ford anymore, even though they kind of realized this might be some money in this, but the quartermaster called them. Ford didn't go to them and say, we'd like back in. So again, that bias that was in the quartermaster, I'm not saying it's good or bad, it just was there. So yeah, I think that, in that sense, if they had stuck just with Bantam, they could have brought Ford in. If they hadn't offered Willis that chance to build a vehicle on their own, they probably wouldn't have built the vehicle. By the time Bantam had theirs in, and so you might have had the Bantam Jeep for the war. So I think from a Truman Commission standpoint, from a historical standpoint, there definitely was some machinations going on and some bending of the rules at best and so on and so forth, which makes for great drama in the book and makes it very human and what was going on. Doesn't take away from Delmar Ruse and his team's greatness and what they eventually accomplished with the MA, the quad, the MA, and the MB, or what Bantam accomplished. But the Truman Commission, I think what happened there was they brought the Bantam people in, and they kind of looked around and said, yeah, maybe we don't want to look too deep into this. And so they really didn't do much more on it after they brought the Bantam people in August 1941. So I do have one resource that talked about Bantam's efforts to get back into building Jeeps, and it just wasn't going to happen. The quartermaster was basically, we're going with the big boys, and that's it. And we have the two manufacturers we want, and thanks for all your work. And here's a contract to build some trailers.
So, final question for you here, Paul. Yeah, there are several aspects of the book which really struck me. One was the unpreparedness of the U.S. military, which you've explained. But then secondly, this huge military bureaucracy that's in place. But I think also, as you point out in the conclusion of your book, it was this awesome vehicle that was produced so successfully despite the pressure of the time and the money and the weight of the procurement process and the unwanted aspect of war. So what's your view of how this project turned out? What it says about, U.S. Entrepreneurship?
I think I like to use the analogy of you're in the restaurant and you don't want to know the sausage making that's going on in the kitchen. But the final thing they put in front of you is really, really good. So what I think my book does detail in 2 points that you made there is the sausage making was unbelievable. And I think it's fantastic reading. Now I wrote a second book, quick tangent, called The Original. So the original Jeeps is an investment of time to really read it. It's not be honest, it's not a page turner. It's like a book you want to read a kind of a chapter at a time because it's so in depth. I threw the kitchen sink and said this might be the only book that ever really details how the Jeep came about. So I wrote a second book called The Original Jeeps and Pictures, which really tells the story in pictures where someone can read the book in like an hour. So, and the original Jeeps is only $20. The original Jeeps and Pictures is only $10. So if someone doesn't want to I don't want to read all the detail, but I really like to see how this came about, they can get the original Jeeps and Pictures. So what it says about the overall is you don't want to know the sausage making, but the end product was one of the greatest vehicles ever created and one of the most iconic. And having all this detail of how that came about, I mean, you could have had a court case or had detail about the Model T or this vehicle or that vehicle, and that's okay. But this is the Jeep. It was one of the key reasons because it was so phenomenal that the Allies won World War II. It could perform in every theater, under every condition, under every imaginable circumstance. And then the ingenuity of Americans in the war, troops using it for all sorts of things that people never would figure out. Okay. So that's the key there. The second part, it really is a testimony to American, and it really is an American product. Ingenuity and also perseverance and stick-to-itiveness. Okay, in terms of you had these basic geniuses at Bantam, Harold Christ in particular, another guy named Ralph Turner and Chester Hepling, but Harold Christ, the early part of the automotive industry was very hands-on. So by 1940, all these people had 20, 25 years experience, but it was very hands-on industry in its early days, right? People built everything with their hands. They developed all their vehicles with their hands. So these people knew vehicles in their blood, okay? And that's not only the Bantam people, but the Willis people and even the Ford people. And yeah, just their ability to take, and you see it, nothing in May 1940 and turn it into a vehicle by September 1940. Okay, what, May, June, July, August, 4 months. They created basically out of thin air one of the most iconic, greatest military weapons and vehicles, but also one of the greatest automotive vehicles ever created, which is still around. So it does speak to, and I think that's something people, they're just the never say die attitude of Willis, for example. These guys were tough people. These people were competitors, okay? These people got in the ring, like Teddy Roosevelt says, the guy in the arena is the one you want. These people were in the arena, all three, duking it out, and eventually what they came out with is, this is the right word, legendary.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for giving us this compelling glimpse into the history of what essentially is a vehicle made of steel and rubber, but it just has so much more meaning behind it. It's really been a pleasure to talk to you today.
Oh, thanks for having me on, Ernest. I really appreciate it. It was a great discussion.
And I thank all of you for tuning in. For online information about this and other podcast topics, log on to outrageoushistory.com. For Outrageous History, I'm Ernest Granson. Outrageous History is produced by Northern Flicker Media.